guests, we have Jonathan Smith. He's visiting us from Washington, D.C. And also we have Yazan Abdin. He's a local. He's from Orlando and local member of our community. He works for the Mark Najami law firm. And I know there are a lot of things. And Sister Yemen, of course, everybody knows her. And with Engage USA, Central Florida Director. And also we have Tammy with Engage USA, also Florida. And did I miss anybody? And of course our guests here. It's a very important topic because we hear on the news, and not everything sometimes you hear on the news you understand it. And unfortunately the rules, the laws that have been changed recently by the new administration, somehow it's going to affect each and every one of us, whether we are citizens or we are green card holders or we are visiting visa holders. If you go to a country where it's on the ban or you are not allowed to visit, the State Department declared it's an unfriendly country, so you are taking a higher risk. And on the way back, you might less Americans visiting that country, so that means if you go there, you become a bigger target. So somehow things are changing, and we need some explanations, and we have resources locally in Orlando and in Florida, legal advices. And we felt it's very compelling to have this discussion tonight. I'm sure you will have questions for our guests, but I'll turn it over to Sister Yemen to introduce our guests and like their background, and then we'll turn the floor over to each one of them to give his part of the speech, and then we'll open the floor for question and answer, and then we have snacks, we have tea, coffee, so we can spend more time one-on-one if you have a personal question you want to ask the lawyers. And even after we finish this tonight's session, if you feel there is more information you need to learn or to know about it, just hopefully we'll get with Sister Yemen. She will give you their contact information and you can call them directly. That, let me put it on there. With that, I'll turn it over, inshallah, to Sister Yemen for the introduction.
Assalamu alaikum.
I'd like to first tell you about our collaboration with Muslim Advocates. Engage Florida and Muslim Advocates have joined us together this evening for a focused discussion on a short and long-term impacts of the President Trump travel ban executive orders and their impact on American Muslim community and beyond. Panelists will provide an overview of the travel ban, its impact on the local community, the prediction of the Supreme Court ruling, and discuss the policies included and related to the travel ban that's not received as much media attention, but nevertheless increasingly impact countless individuals. Following the panel presentation, there will be an extended Q&A session in which the community members can voice their questions and concerns. The goal is to educate the community members about what is happening and hopefully leave you empowered to remain vigilant and regardless of what the Supreme Court ultimately decides. I would like to introduce our local immigration attorney, Yazan Abdin. He's a practicing attorney in Central Florida and has recently expanded his practice to include asylum removal, TPS, and deferred action. Mr. Abdin continued work with clients from around the world, including the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Yazan received his Bachelor's from Science from the University of Central Florida in 2012 and continued directly to law school thereafter. As the son of two immigrant parents, Yazan developed a keen interest for the field of immigration law, and during law school he participated in an immigration clinic where he has assisted clients with their immigration needs. Moreover, attorney Abdin is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and Orange County Bar Association. Next to me here is Jonathan Smith, who serves as a legal director of the Muslim Advocate. Most recently, Jonathan served as a senior counselor to Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice of Civil Rights Division. where he helped manage the department work on religious discrimination. Prior to this Civil Rights Division, Jonathan served as staff attorney for NAACP, Legal Defense, and Educational Fund, Economic Justice Practice, and working on matters involving employment discrimination. You really have a really beautiful resume right here. I can go on, but he has great credentials, and he also studied in Harvard. I would like to thank them both for coming today. I would like to the audience to thank them for their efforts. And I would like to start off with Jonathan and tell us a little bit more about the Muslim Band 3.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you to Engage and to all of you for being here tonight. On behalf of Muslim Advocates, we are a national civil rights law firm that works to make sure that all people can live in this country free from discrimination, no matter what you believe or where you come from. We are obviously very concerned about the rise of anti-Muslim discrimination and bigotry that we see in this country, particularly with President Trump. But we know that it's bigger than just one person, and that there's a real atmosphere of discrimination that's targeted many communities, particularly communities of color in this country. I wanted to talk a little bit about the travel ban or the Muslim ban, which has been a key part of President Trump's platform, both when he was running for president and also as president now. And so I was going to talk about what's happening with the Muslim ban. There's been a lot of court cases. It often gets really confusing. I'm a lawyer who does this all day, and I get confused by all the different cases that are happening. So hopefully we can try to break that down and talk about how these policies may impact you all and your communities as well. So just to give a little bit of background, we know that when Donald Trump was running for president, one of the biggest and most central parts of his campaign was to have a complete shutdown on Muslim immigration to the United States. After the terrorist attacks in San Bernardino, California, he kind of really started talking about this Muslim ban. He went on TV with Anderson Cooper on CNN and said things like, "I believe Islam hates us. I think we need to kind of stop these people from coming into the country." Eventually, he was told that he can't just kind of say that he's not going to let people in the country because of their faith. So then instead he started talking about blocking immigration from certain countries and certain territories. And then when he was elected president in November, and when he took office in January, one of the first things he did on January 27th was to implement the first version of his Muslim ban, which, as you recall, barred people from 7 countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen, from being able to come into the country for 90 days. Immediately, that policy was challenged in the courts as being unlawful, violated, you can't bar people just because of their religion. That policy was blocked by the courts almost immediately, and so then President Trump kind of did a second version of the policy in March of this year. On March 6th, he came out with the second version that was basically the same as the first version, except that he took Iraq off the list, left the other 6 countries, and they added some other kind of changes that didn't really do much. That version was also blocked by courts almost immediately, and the Department of Justice continued to defend the president's policies that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. In June, the Supreme Court said they agreed to hear the case, and they actually set an argument date for this upcoming Tuesday, October 10th, to hear the case to determine whether or not President Trump's travel ban is illegal, unconstitutional. The Supreme Court also allowed a portion of it to go into effect for some people for 90 days. So from June 24th or so until September 24th, it was in effect in this narrow way. On September 24th, which was a couple of weeks ago, as you probably know, President Trump announced that because his initial second version was expiring, he was going to come out with a third version of the travel ban, which is now in effect. And that now bars people from 8 countries. So it's Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, which were on the original list of countries. He also added the country of Chad and added the country of North Korea, the countries of North Korea and Venezuela. When they came up with this new policy on September 24th, the president and his lawyers then went to the Supreme Court and said, there's no reason for you to hear that case in October because that policy's gone. We have a new policy, and this policy is different. The Supreme Court is currently considering those arguments, but the Supreme Court has already removed the argument for Tuesday from its calendar. So we know that it's not going to hear this case on Tuesday. It may decide to hear the case later, it may decide not to hear the case at all, but right now, there's going to be no Supreme Court argument. What the government is arguing, and what they've argued all along, is that this policy isn't about banning Muslims from the country. This policy is about keeping our country safe. And they rely on some reports that were done by different federal agencies, by the Department of Homeland Security, by the Department of State. And the central question in all these cases is who's right? Is it what the government says, that this is about national security? Or is this what, like, the lawyers, who are bringing these lawsuits say, that this is all about discrimination against Muslims and the Muslim community? And ultimately, that may be a question that the Supreme Court decides. But I think when we look at the record, I think it's pretty clear what's going on here, right? When we look at the president's own words, it's not just the words he said, back to Anderson Cooper, back in March of 2016, but even just a few weeks ago, after the attack in London, the terrorist attack, yet again, President Trump was on Twitter talking about we need a ban. He always talks about, quote, radical Islamic terrorism and extremists. It's clear if you listen to the president, if you listen to his advisors, that they have a very narrow and warped and twisted view about what Islam is and who the Muslim community is. And in their mind, it's really clear that this entire community, this entire faith, is all about ISIS and Al Qaeda and terrorism. And it's not. And not only is that not true, that's not obviously not what Islam is about, but also that's not what we are about as a country. That we recognize that yes, that there are bad people who would do bad things to us, and no one wants those people in the country. But I think what we also know, and what we all saw just a few days ago in Las Vegas, is that bad people come in all colors, they come from all countries, they come from all backgrounds, and so the notion that we could kind of pick particular religions or pick particular countries and say, don't let those people in here, that simply just isn't who we are. And that's why we, at Muslim Advocates, continue to fight and will continue to fight this Muslim ban as long as we can and all the places that we can. Just this week we filed 3 lawsuits against the Muslim ban. We filed a case on behalf of an Iranian student group in Maryland, actually based in New York, but has a lot of members in Maryland. And we argue on behalf of that group that these people, their members, these students, they have the right to come to this country to study. They have the right to have their family members come into the country. They have the right to have their parents and their grandparents come and get to know them and settle here. And that this isn't about national security. This is about basic dignity and about allowing all people to enjoy what makes our country great. We also filed a lawsuit in New York this week because, when the president released his proclamation on Sunday on September 24th for the new version of the Muslim ban, if you read the document, he says, these countries are dangerous. These 8 countries are dangerous. But then he says, we won't tell you why we think they're dangerous because all that's classified. We won't tell you any information about how we got to these 8 countries. And so we filed a lawsuit saying, that's not fair. President Trump, if you want to pick these countries, if you're going to say these people are so dangerous that we can't let any of their citizens come into this country, you have to actually tell us some information why you believe that. And if you want us to accept your national security arguments and rationale, we won't just take your word for it. You actually have to have evidence. You have to have facts to actually back that up. The president often talks about kind of fake news, but like here, I think this is really a president who is engaging in a lot of fake news when it comes to this travel ban, because he hasn't provided any information, any data, any hard knowledge to justify why he is continuing picking on these Muslim majority countries for this policy. So we've filed these lawsuits to get more information and to really get the administration and to get the president to be more honest, to be more transparent. And we think when we get this information, what we're going to see is we're going to see evidence that there is no justification for this policy, that there is no national security reason for this policy. The Department of Homeland Security back in February came out with a report which already said that. They said, if you actually want to stop terrorists from doing bad things in this country, the way you do that isn't by picking whole nations and saying, don't come in here. The way you do that is actually trying to find the terrorists and stop them and prevent them. And that isn't about country or nationality or religion. It's about actually finding people who have been radicalized and stopping them. So we're going to continue to fight and challenge this travel ban. As I mentioned before, the case will not be heard by the Supreme Court on Tuesday, but it's likely with all these other cases that have been filed, the cases I just mentioned, other cases, that this may ultimately get back to the Supreme Court. And so this is going to be a lot of kind of ups and downs and twists. It's going to be very confusing as different judges in different parts of the country say different things. But one thing that I think you should remember and kind of it can be confusing to follow all the details, but essentially every court, like the vast majority of courts that have looked at the travel ban to date, have all concluded that President Trump is engaging in discrimination. And so I think that's really important, that he may keep saying this is about national security, and they may keep issuing new versions of this policy dressed up with different languages, but the courts continue to look through that and see what this really is, which is discrimination. The other thing I just want to say really quickly is that besides for the travel ban, we also see that the president is enacting a whole number of other policies that are designed to really stop and prevent Muslim communities from coming to this country and from just Muslim people from being able to live and enjoy all the freedoms that we take for granted. And this isn't just about the 6 or 8 countries on the list. The president often talks about his, quote, extreme vetting program, which isn't limited to any particular country. But we see from all the evidence that we have so far that it's people who are Muslim, people who come from Muslim majority countries, people who are perceived to be Muslims, that always are the ones who end up stuck with these kind of extreme vetting policies. We see what the president's doing is he's increasingly having his federal agencies, the Department of State, for example, increasingly ask people when they apply for a visa, whether a tourist visa or a student visa, to give more and more categories of information about themselves. All the places that they've lived for 15 years, all the places that they've worked, all the places that they've traveled and how they paid for the travel. Now we see that they're asking for all their kind of social media information. So if you have a Facebook account or an Instagram account or a Twitter account, you have to give all that information to the government. And not only are we concerned about the fact that they're collecting all this information and we don't know what they're doing with it, we also believe that they're going to use this information to try to trip people up, to say oh look, you said that you lived in this place 10 years ago, but actually we found out you lived across the street, so therefore we're not going to let you into the country. That they're using all these kind of paperwork and requirements as a way just to kind of keep people out. And once again, that's not really who we are as a people, and that's why we continue to fight against those policies. We also see that increasingly when people travel at airports, which I know particularly here in Florida, there's a lot of international airports and borders, we see that increasingly people who are Muslim or people who are perceived to be Muslim are increasingly being stopped, they're being detained, they're being kind of questioned for long periods of time. And not just question about, where are you coming from, what are you doing, which would be fair questions. There'll be a question about, what do you believe? How often do you go to mosque? How often do you pray? What do you think about ISIS? And again, that's also discrimination, that's profiling, that's wrong, that's not who we are as a country, that violates our laws. And so we have a number of different legal actions that we have currently pending, trying to find out what federal agents are doing and to try to stop that. Just to give one example, increasingly we see that federal agents are asking people for their smartphones, for their tablets, for your laptops when you go through the airport or the border. And And this is something, to be fair, that even the Obama administration did. But to give an example of how much worse it's gotten under the Trump administration, last year in 2016, the Obama administration, there were 5,000 cases where they would ask someone for their laptop, when they were at an airport over the course of the whole year. 5,000. In February of this year alone, there were 5,000 cases by the Trump administration. So what we see is that, if they continue on that number, there will be 60, 70,000 of these cases happening all over the country. And we know who are the people who are dealing with these. People who are Muslim, people who are perceived to be Muslim, people who are brown, people who are of color, that we see the ways in which this administration continues to target and harass people simply because of what they look like and what they believe. The last thing I'll say is that, it can be really, I think, depressing to think about all of these challenges that we're facing. Sometimes, when I look at the news and I see all of the just terrible, bigoted things coming from the White House and coming from the president, it could just be overwhelming. But, I think there's some reason for hope. First, as I mentioned before, we have seen federal courts, federal judges all across the country say, no, President Trump, you can't do this, that this isn't who we are. This isn't what we are. This isn't who we are as Americans. This isn't what it means to be in this country. And we will continue to fight that and use the courts to vindicate these important and fundamental rights. But more importantly, not just in the courts of law, in the courts of public opinion, we see that increasingly Americans are saying, wait a minute, this isn't who we are. So when President Trump issued his first travel ban in January, the next day there were thousands of people right at airports, at courthouses, in public places around the country, rallying, protesting, holding up signs, saying, no, we can't do this, we can't profile people. And again, that gives me hope, because in the face of all these challenges, in the face of all this discrimination, in the face of all this bigotry, there's obviously a core of Americans who are saying, we will stand up against this, we will fight against this. And I think increasingly we need to mobilize that part of the country, those parts of our community, and do all that we can to stand up to what we see coming from this president and from this White House. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you.
First of all, thank you to Engage. No, I'm good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. In the back? You can hear me? I'll speak louder. So, Assalamu alaikum, first of all, to everybody. Thank you to Engage and Muslim Advocates. This is a great seminar, and we need more things like this. I feel like, it helps us get to know each other, first of all. It brings our community together, and it gives us some hope, which I think we need right now. So it's a positive thing, and hopefully everyone walks away feeling a little bit empowered and, higher spirits. So I work for Nijaim Law, which is a local firm here, and I practice exclusively in the field of immigration. And so I've been dealing with this for several months now, and it's been exhausting. The president has done a lot of things, and we've been battling it as best we can. A lot of organizations, I'm not going to name any, but you know who they are. A lot of nonprofit organizations have done wonderful things, filing lawsuits on behalf of the Muslims and other people as well. And alhamdulillah, so far it's been going well. As Jonathan said, the courts have blocked a lot of what the president has done up to this point. The Supreme Court gave in a little bit, but they did give a narrow interpretation of the order, not the most recent one, the one before that, number 2. And so that was helpful, and it did limit and elaborate on who was allowed in, who wasn't. So for example, green card holders, we know green card holders are okay, right? Dual citizens, that was a big question with the executive order number 1. We weren't sure how dual citizens would be treated. We know how dual citizens will be treated now. So as long as you're using your US passport to enter the US, you should be okay. So a lot of things have been clarified, so at least that's helpful now. At least we know where we stand. But it's still not good enough, and we still need to keep fighting, and we need to, get to the bottom of this, because this is not acceptable, and it's obvious racism and bigotry, So recently, the president has added 3 new countries to the list, as you might know: Chad, North Korea, Venezuela. Pretty much what it says is immigrants from those 3 countries will not be allowed in. I believe, and Jonathan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Supreme Court's interpretation still applies here, where if you have ties to the U.S., that's an exception,
Until October 18th, and then it will go away.
and then that'll go away. So then the Supreme Court will need to issue a new ruling on this most recent. So until that date, at least, we know basically that if you have a tie to the U.S., in other words, if you're employed in the U.S., if you're going to school in the U.S., if you have certain ties as far as family goes in the U.S., then that allows you to come in, that allows you to apply for visas. We'll see what happens. I'm not one of those people that likes to predict things or try to predict anything, so I have no idea what the Supreme Court will do. I mean, it's surprised us. I know I've read cases and opinions where I was shocked at the outcome, so I'm not even going to try to predict anything. I don't want to talk too much. I want to open it up for questions. I think that's the most important thing. We're here for you guys, and I want you to be able to ask the questions you have. So that's all I have to say about that. You want me to talk about DACA a little bit? If you don't mind showing your hands, if you would like to, you don't have to. Does anybody know what DACA is? Have you heard of DACA? Okay. And so that's good. If you've heard of it, it means you're either paying attention or you have family or friends that are on DACA. So DACA is an executive order from President Obama, and President Trump recently issued a new order basically doing away with DACA. And so yesterday was the cutoff date to apply for DACA, and if you did not, then you basically, that's it. Once your DACA card expires, once your employment expires, you're done. You're no longer protected under that. Hopefully Congress will come up with something. I try to be positive. I want to be hopeful about it, but at the same time, our legislative branch has disappointed me quite a few times as well. But we'll see. There's supposed to be something, going through the House. So we'll see what happens with DACA as well. One of the best pieces of advice I can give you, if you're like me, I don't like to watch the news because it's a lot of negativity, so I prefer to read things. But if you're interested in immigration, you want updates, I do a newsletter where it's just informative. Whenever something happens, an executive order, the DACA change, anything like that, I send it out to an email list. So if you are interested in what's going on in the immigration world, if it's something that affects you and your families or friends, and that's something you want to know about regularly, then I'd be more than happy to add you to that list.
Yeah, great. So I guess if there are any, do folks have any questions, either about the travel ban, about DACA, about any of the kind of issues of kind of civil rights or discrimination?
Go ahead. I have a question. I happen to be a frequent flyer to the Gulf region.
Can you hear him in the back?
I was surprised.
Assalamu alaikum. I was saying I'm a frequent flyer to the Gulf region. Flying from, say, Saudi Arabia to the Gulf, we were surprised to find the U.S. Customs offices are already there. So now you have to go through customs in the U.S. And just like over here, they have their own offices, their own dogs, their own everything, Is that something that's new or just happened recently, or how is that?
So yeah, I mean, I don't know kind of every kind of specific relationship, but I think one of the things that I think the federal government has been doing has been, I think, trying to kind of increase, what they say is increase their cooperation with kind of other countries, and particularly countries that they think, may, be exporters of terrorism, right? So I think we see this both with the countries themselves. And so, for example, one of the reasons why Iraq got off the list, right, was because the Iraqi government agreed to a whole number of kind of different policies and procedures. The same thing with Sudan. Sudan's was on 1 and 2, it's off of 3, but now there's a kind of whole host of different restrictions in place. And so I think, part of the challenge is that the government's not being very clear about these changes. They're not telling people exactly what they're agreeing to. So we don't fully know that, and I think there are some efforts to get more transparency about that. The other thing that's happening, which may be in your question, is that we also see that the government's working with the airlines, like some of the major kind of Gulf carriers or countries like the Emirates, flyers like that, and try to get them to also kind of agree to different kind of restrictions or protocols. And so you may remember over, I think the spring, there was a time where like if you were flying from certain countries, you couldn't have a laptop. You had to keep your laptop like you had with your checked baggage. And then they kind of relaxed that once the airlines agreed to against some other policies, some other screening mechanisms. But again, we don't really know what those are. And so I think it's really difficult to actually kind of understand exactly what kind of restrictions are being imposed and how much of that's from the U.S. government as opposed to the other countries.
Well, it's not the restrictions. It's once you enter the Emirates, you are in U.S. territory. You know, you have your machines, you put your passport there, and you are facing U.S. custom agent, and all of a sudden you are in U.S. territory, I was told. Now you clear everything. And once we arrived here, the plane arrived in Orlando, we didn't go to customs. We just landed somewhere else, and they took us in buses. So what I'm saying is, what does it use? And what's the use of having, customs over there instead of here? Is it just to screen the people over there before they arrive over here?
I think,
It's
yeah, I
easier?
think they're trying to.
That's
I think
the point
as
I'm
part
trying
of
to
that.
make.
Yeah, I think they're trying to just kind of.
So instead of coming
insource
here
some of
and,
that.
sending them and feeding them and locking them up, and they screen them over there in the Middle East, and then,
And
then-
also, I think, I mean, I don't, but I think also, I think my thought is like the reason why they may be doing this more and more is like it's also a lot easier for them to kind of they have a lot more discretion. Like once you're
Exactly.
here on American soil, there's a lot more people looking. You have more rights actually. When you're still kind of technically abroad, your rights kind of don't fully kick in as much.
I think that's part of it, and also I've actually seen this fairly frequently. It's something the U.S. has started doing.
The last thing I want to say is flying from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi to Orlando. As an American citizen, they take your luggage on the side without you present, and they drill holes in the upper side of your suitcases while the suitcase is open. They can open it and look into it. But isn't the law required that a person be there when his luggage is open, or at least they can leave a message inside or a card that we opened your luggage? They're doing that for a lot of people now.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is that when you are at a border, either in this country or even over abroad, you have a lot less kind of legal protections than you do in other places. But you, as a citizen, you still have protections, and so I think there have been some challenges to where the government goes too far. I think what's also a challenge is that sometimes, and again, I don't know like the specific facts of the situation, but a lot of times what the federal agents will do is that they will kind of get people to consent or do things that they can then say they've consented to these types of searches of their
I
property.
never consented to anything. My luggage was coming from Riyadh, 2 hours layover in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. And when I got home, there was 2 drills, 2 holes right in there. The luggage is open, you can look inside of it. My understanding is you have to be present. They have to leave a note inside the bag, saying we did search it, And I called immigration at the airport over here. They said they're supposed to be present, but they are actually violating passengers' rules.
And what happened when you called? What do they say?
You have to file a claim. It might take 3-4 months, and the maximum we pay for luggage that's damaged is like $39, and the luggage I paid.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think they also know that most people are never going to file a claim.
Exactly.
Most people aren't going to go through the whole bureaucratic process.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right. I think that there's also people know that they can get away with a lot more stuff because no one complains, if no one actually says anything, no one knows it happened.
This is too much. I understand. Thank you for your answer.
Any question from the sister side? Any comment? You have a question?
I do.
Okay.
It's not necessarily concerning immigration per se, but as you were saying that, they're trying to collect more information, the administration and everything. And I was reading in an article, because like you said, the news is very depressing, it's hard to watch, so reading is one of the main ways to get it. And they stated that they're actually trying to collect information from anyone who has posted anything against the administration. Anything that they posted negatively about Trump or how they, don't support him or anything like that, that they're trying to get the information of these people. So what exactly does that entail for, people who have been outspoken about their dislike for the administration?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think there's a number of different policies underway or attempted policies underway that I think are really designed to get at this kind of social media kind of bucket of information. So first you have the State Department is increasingly, as I mentioned, asking for kind of social media information from people who are applying for visas. We also just learned just a few days ago that the Department of Homeland Security is also in the process of also collecting social media information as well, not just from people who are trying to come into the country, but also from green card holders, from nationalized citizens, that there's a whole category of people that they're saying, we're going to just kind of search the internet, and if you have public statements, or if your Facebook account is open to the public, anyone can see it, we're going to collect all that information. I think that there's real questions about, first of all, what are you looking for? Like if I post on my Facebook account, I don't like President Trump, why is that relevant to whether or not I am a national security threat? And more importantly, with the government, why is the government looking for that information, and what are they doing with it? And we actually have submitted a number of series of whenever they make these changes, they have to kind of formally tell the public they're doing it, and then we have the public has the opportunity to kind of submit comments and concerns. And we just did that for the State Department regulations. We're in the process of doing that for the Homeland Security regulations. And I think one of the arguments we make is that these government, and I used to work for the government, so these government officials have no training about how to actually look at this information, how to actually understand this information, even if it were relevant. And I don't think that they've even proved that. How do you actually determine what information actually speaks to whether someone is a violent extremist? I was actually just at a conference with a bunch of law enforcement officials and counterterrorism officials, and they were making the point that increasingly we even see that when local law enforcement will also do this, like the local police will go and look at trying to kind of break up local gangs. They may go and look at social media. And the thing that increasingly law enforcement is realizing is that when people post on social media, you use code words, you use slang, you don't use formal, proper English. You may be talking in kind of ways that you talk with your friends casually. And no one, if you're some government bureaucrat in DC, you don't know that. You don't know the community context. You don't know if that's being in sarcasm, or if it's a joke, or if it's an inside thing between your friends. And so we shouldn't just we shouldn't expect the government should have all this information. We'll use this information properly, and we'll actually kind of find the bad people. All I have to say though, the government actually has a lot of discretion to do this, and so we are in the process of, I think, filing these public comments. I suspect that there may be some legal challenges, once they start collecting this information. But honestly, it's going to be a challenge that, the government has a lot of discretion, and particularly if this information is kind of public, if your privacy settings aren't sufficiently protected, that is public information. And so I think one of the things that you all should do, and particularly if you have children or family members, make sure that their accounts are kind of have the appropriate privacy settings, right? Because you don't want people, to be kind of tripped up in something or caught in something because of a joke that was misinterpreted by somebody. So I think it's really important that you check your own privacy settings, you check your children's and your family's privacy settings. I also think it's important to just maybe be thoughtful about what you post on social media. I think sometimes, we live in an age where people post everything all the time, and I think, maybe that's not a good thing for probably lots of reasons, but particularly, in this context, I think, we don't know how the government's using this. And I will say too, if you remember, after 9/11, there were lots of law enforcement agencies, the NYPD, the LAPD, the FBI, that after the September 11th attacks would go and this was before social media was so big, but they would infiltrate mosques and communities, and they would look at different things that people said and did. And so I think it's not unreasonable to think that we may be returning to that type of climate and atmosphere. And I think people should take steps to protect themselves, to be careful. And that doesn't mean that you have to live in fear every moment, but it does mean that you need to be thoughtful and strategic and prudent about kind of what information you're putting out there about yourself, and how that information may be misinterpreted or misused by people who may not have the purest of intentions.
Any more questions or comment?
I have a question. Are you at the airport? Are you required by the law to give your information, or you can deny that at the airport? If they ask you for the information, your phone, your social media, you can just deny that. No?
So if you're a U.S., it depends on your status. If you're a U.S. citizen and you have not like committed any type of crime or done anything, you cannot be denied access to into the country, right? So if you're a citizen and they say, we want your passport, you can say no, and they can compel you to get that. What they can do is they can keep you, kind of for several hours. They can try to wear you down. Like, they may do things to kind of get you to change your mind, but they, kind of don't have that right to block you from coming into your own country. If you are a green card holder, you kind of have less protections, and obviously if you are a non-citizen, you have the lowest amount of protections. And if you're a non-citizen in particular, and they say, you don't give them the information, they can then deny you access to the country.
Yes, sister, back there.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for your time tonight. I was curious as to, with the new travel ban, now that non-Muslim majority countries have been added, what the legal argument is, especially if it does go to the Supreme Court, like what the constitutional argument would be for why the change is valid.
So there's now 8 countries on the list. 2 of them are, they added 3 Chad. Chad is about 55% Muslim, so it still is a Muslim majority country. But then they added North Korea, which clearly is not a Muslim majority country, and Venezuela, which is clearly not a Muslim majority country. I think one of the best arguments against why that doesn't kind of change the fact that this is a Muslim ban is the fact that, like, first of all, no one comes here from North Korea, right? Because it's North Korea and we're about to go to nuclear war, right? Literally in 2016, 9 people came to North Korea on the immigrant visa directly. Most people, candidly, who are North Koreans who want to come into the United States will likely find a way to South Korea, maybe to China, but no one's kind of coming directly from North Korea to the United States. And so that ban is meaningless, right? Because it's not doing anything, right? And I think if anyone were coming from North Korea, I think justifiably people would have lots of questions about that. Venezuela, if you look at this new ban is a little bit tricky because the old version just said, if you're from one of these countries, you can't come in, basically. This new policy is more like a matrix. So there's the countries that are banned, and then there's types of visas. And so depending on what type of visa you're seeking, you may or may not be covered. And so if you are a student from Iran, you actually are allowed to come in even under the new policy. But if you want to come in as a tourist from Iran, you are barred. And so it's different for each country. What's interesting about Venezuela, the only other so for North Korea, everyone's banned, but again, no one comes, so it doesn't matter. For Venezuela, the only people who are banned from coming under this new policy are a small category of government officials and their family members. So literally, this really, really small category of people cannot come here on tourist visas. And that's more about kind of getting back at Venezuela from not kind of being helpful or kind of geopolitical, and that's about actually having a policy that's stopping people who are likely to be terrorists from coming into the country. Right? There's no evidence that Venezuelan government officials and their family members are likely to engage in acts of terror. And so the fact is that there are 2 Muslim countries added to the list, but the travel restrictions for those countries are both essentially meaningless, right? They are so small, that they're so narrow, that they don't really speak to the kind of the heart of who is being banned. Whereas if you look at Syria, no one essentially from Syria can come into the country. You look at Somalia, extreme restrictions of who can come into the country. And so again, at the end of the day, who is bearing the burden of these policies? And it's clear the burden is being felt by Muslim majority countries. And, I think a related question sometimes people ask is that it's not a Muslim ban because not all Muslims are banned from coming to the country, like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, whatever, pick your other Muslim country. That's ridiculous, right? We all know that, right? Because if someone came to a policy and said, black people from Florida can't go to this place, no one would say, well, that's not racist because black people from Georgia can come. No, whenever you actually pick a person because of, in this case, their religion or their race, and you say, we are treating you differently, that is wrong. That is discrimination, and it doesn't take rocket science to realize that. And so I think we need to, I think there's a lot of attempts from the media, there's a lot of attempts by the government to say it's not a Muslim ban because of these other countries, because of all these other things. And I think it's really important to fight back against that and say, you know what, if it looks like a Muslim ban, if it smells like a Muslim ban, if it is shaped like a Muslim ban, it is a Muslim ban. And at the end of the day, I think it's 158 million people are in that kind of the 6 Muslim majority countries that we are blocking into this country. And the only reason that we're doing that is because of their religious background. And that is what we need to be talking about. And that is the real harm. And that's something that I think as courts have recognized time and time and time again, that violates our fundamental rights and our Constitution. And we have to keep making that point to anyone and everyone who will hear that.
Question. So if these banned versions like 1, 2, or 3 are set up to be on a temp, I guess status, what is the long-term goal of the government? Do they actually seek to have a permanent one in place later on if everything goes, as planned, and especially if the Supreme Court decides to hear and sides with the side of the White House? So is that something that they have, that they're thinking about, or?
So yeah, that's a good question. So actually, a point I meant to clarify. So the first version and the second version were both time limited. They were for 90 days. This newest version is not time limited. It's indefinite. And we actually, when we talk about it, say that in some ways this is the worst version because these restrictions that we just were talking about will go on forever. Now the government says they don't go on forever because as soon as the countries fix their problems, that again we won't tell you what the problems are, but as soon as they fix it, we'll take them off the list. So like it's not forever, it's just until they fix these problems. But again, if anyone thinks that like Iran is coming off that list anytime soon, you're kidding yourself. If you think Syria is coming off that list, it doesn't matter if North Korea comes off the list because no one's coming. But I think that the reality is that now this new ban is indefinite, and essentially that means it's forever. And so I think that's what we have often been saying. And to be fair to the White House, that has been their plan all along. The president said when he issued the first version and the second version, he said, I'm just going to do this for 90 days, and then we can do the study, and we can figure out what the real problem is. And I think it's a little bit curious that they did the study, and the list of countries looks eerily similar to the countries that they had before they did the study. And again, that speaks to, do we really think that this is a national security justification, or do we think that this is just kind of discrimination that's motivating this? And again, I think that this isn't to say that there aren't real problems in countries around the world, but there aren't really ways that we can make our national security better. Of course there are. But the fact is that at the end of the day, how is it that the only countries in the world, the 200-something odd countries that have any meaningful problems in their national security, happen to just be Muslim majority countries? I mean, again, that defies common sense. And I would also say to your point about kind of the time limits, when we were talking about some of these social media changes, talking about some of these other requirements, those also are forever, right? And in some ways, those are actually worse than even the travel ban, because the travel ban is high profile, the Supreme Court's going to decide it, people talk about it, but these other things, no one talks about that, right? No one really thinks about what application you have to fill out when you get a visa, right? And we all know that once you have government agencies to start to do something and start collecting information, it's really, really hard to get a bureaucracy to change that. And so what's the challenge is not just that the travel ban is happening, we're actually baking in discrimination into our immigration system in a way that I think really speaks to, a real long-term problem and challenge that's going to be with us likely for our country for a long time if we don't stop it now.
And just to clarify something, when we say indefinite while this current administration is in office, now a new administration can come and do away with a lot of this.
Sure, yeah, I mean, yes, it's indefinite as long as...
Just wanted to clarify that, so it's not like that's it, this is the law of the land forever and ever.
But I would say, again, and again, maybe the travel ban, a new administration will change, but the reality is that, it's really hard for an administration, even a Democratic, friendly administration, to come in and say, we're going to kind of loosen, restrictions or trying to get rid of terrorists, right? Even I worked in the Obama administration, and there were lots of good people there, but it was really hard for even the Obama administration to say, we're going to, kind of do away with some of these things, which, I think everyone knew were bad things, but, again, the politics of our country are so that it's really difficult to ever make it seem like you're kind of soft on terrorism, you're soft on crime. And so, yes, I think it is, we can hold out hope for, a new administration, but I think we also need to be recognize that, a new Democratic administration will not solve all of these problems. And that, some of these problems, like I mentioned about the social media and the electronic devices, a lot of those problems started under the Obama administration. So I think we need to also just be mindful of the fact that this isn't just about getting rid of President Trump. This is really about dealing with the atmosphere of suspicion and bigotry that's directed towards the broader Muslim community.
Can you talk about expanding Muslim Advocates' footprint in Orlando? I mean, you guys are just now starting in Orlando, right? Or you haven't started in Orlando?
So we're a national organization. We have an office we're based in California, and then I actually just joined Muslim Advocates in February, and we've now opened a DC office. So we're, unlike CARE or some other organizations that have like chapters all over the country, we're not. That's not our kind of model. We are more, kind of a legal organization that kind of will work with community partners, like Engage and others to kind of do things like this or work together. And so I think one of the things that I personally would love to explore are there ways that we can work together. Like we don't want to kind of come and like kind of duplicate the great efforts that groups are already doing. Engage is, I think, going to be an example of that. But I do think if there are ways that we can work together, if there are ways that we can amplify some of those things, if there are ways that we can bring like our particular like legal expertise, we're happy to.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا
The other question was, you talk about filing lawsuits to the government. One example is on behalf of those Iranian students. Can you tell me what that like a successful lawsuit against the government does, like in terms of impact, and what an unsuccessful lawsuit against the government does?
Sure. So to give you the example, so we filed the lawsuit on behalf of those Iranian students on Monday. Actually, earlier today, we, along with the ACLU in a different lawsuit, but before the same judge, went back to court and said, we actually would like you to block the Muslim ban 3.0 from going into effect, in full effect on October 18th. As I mentioned, that's when kind of all the provisions kick in. So right now, we are actually, we submitted papers to the court today. The government has until next week to respond. A week from Tuesday, on October 17th, the day before it's supposed to go into effect, we're actually going to go to court. We're going to make legal arguments. If we're successful, the judge can block it from going into effect. And if you recall, that's what happened to like 1.0 and 2.0, right? Like 2.0 never went into effect until the Supreme Court because actually the same judge that we're before right now blocked it the day before and said, I think that this is discrimination, I won't allow it. And so we've returned to that same judge and said, listen, judge, I know that they're saying that this is different. We're saying this is the same exact policy, and just the way you blocked it before, we want you to block it again. If we're successful with that, then what will happen is that the government will no doubt appeal that, and you kind of appeal it up until you get to the Supreme Court. Either way, even if we lose, even if the judge says, you know what, I agree with the government this time, then we would appeal that, right? And so I think, that's why I said before, it's very likely that this case will end up back before the Supreme Court, even if they don't hear it next week, because at the end of the day, both sides are going to keep kind of fighting this out, and it's only the Supreme Court that will be able to kind of ultimately decide this issue.
Judge, at what level are you applying?
See, the way it works, you have to start at district court level, which is like the initial level, then you go to the Court of Appeals, which is like the first appeal, and then you go to the Supreme Court. So there's 3 levels. And so because this policy just came out like 2 weeks ago, we have to kind of start all over at the district court level, which is where we are. But the good news is that because we're before the same district court that heard the version, the 2.0 version, he kind of already knows like a lot of this, right? And so it's not like this judge is writing on a blank slate. This is a judge who has already found the prior version to be unlawful, and we are hopeful that this judge will agree with us again.
I'm sure this question, a lot of people's mind, we're talking about policies, we're talking about constitution or executive order. But people like in the country now, for like us, whether green card holders or citizens, they think, like, what does this mean to me at my level? Can you share with us some like cases where in other states that somebody like did not travel but was impacted with this? And the same thing with the immigration is, and if you can share with us, like the new policies, like some people they're in the process of becoming naturalization, or like what are the obstacles that they've been created with the new administration?
So I haven't seen anybody be affected yet as far as change of status in the U.S. or adjustment of status or naturalization. I haven't seen anybody be affected yet. That hasn't been a problem for us. As far as what could happen going forward, if this travel ban 3.0 goes into effect and none of the courts stop it, then if you're here on a visitor visa and the Supreme Court doesn't lay out any exceptions, for example, like they previously did for a visitor visa holder, then when you go to change your status, you might have a problem at that point, or adjust your status to that of a legal permanent resident. So I think it's really going to depend on what happens as this works its way through the court system. Will the Supreme Court once again give us exceptions to this executive order? Are they going to give us, okay, it doesn't apply to people who have certain familial ties or, are here for educational purposes and have a tie to their school, etc., or are they not going to do that?
I would just say, even if you're not from one of these like 8 or 6 countries, even if you don't travel internationally, you don't kind of do this, I do think people are dealing with this kind of in a daily basis, because I think the challenge is that for many people, who are looking at all of this around the country, I think what they see is that this is a Muslim ban. I think, President Trump campaigned on a Muslim ban, and I think many of his followers and supporters see like this is what he's doing. He's carrying through his campaign promise. And what we are seeing at Muslim Advocates is like the rise of hate crimes, the rise of acts of discrimination, which is again targeted, I think, to like Muslim people and even non-Muslim people, but like Sikh people who have like who wear head coverings, so all of a sudden find themselves being attacked, being discriminated, because I think a lot of people say, if the president can do it, if the president can say it, why can I do that? And so I think we are seeing kind of a double-digit rise in the number of hate crimes, acts of discrimination. We recently at Muslim Advocates just took on a case. I was telling someone about this earlier of a family in Kansas. Nothing to do with from Iraq, but nothing to do like in this country for a long time. But he just went to the bank to deposit a check, and all of a sudden they called the police on him because they thought that he was a terrorist. So like the ways in which that like innocent people live their lives and are caught up in acts of discrimination. And I think it's really important when these things happen. I think sometimes there can be a tendency to say like, well, I don't want to talk about that. Like, it's embarrassing, it's shameful, like I just kind of want it to go away. But I think it's really important that when these things happen, that we actually kind of speak about them, we acknowledge them, that we kind of hold people accountable for that, because I think otherwise it normalizes this atmosphere of discrimination and bigotry, and it makes it like seem like it's okay. And I think it's really important to recognize that like this is affecting, cases of bullying we've heard all across the country have gone up, in terms of kids, having their hijabs pulled off, kids being bullied, kids being called ISIS, terrorists, go back to your country. And again, that isn't who we are as a country, and that isn't about the travel ban. That's just about this atmosphere of discrimination that we are allowing. And I think that's a way that I think lots of communities, and this is what we're seeing, continue to deal with the impacts of these policies.
Something I just thought of, side note from the travel ban, immigration-wise, that is good to know for everybody, regardless of your religion or whether you're from one of those countries. The Department of State has implemented a new 90-day rule. Have you heard about that? And so back prior to this, it was a 30-60-day rule, basically saying that, if you come to the U.S. and you change status, adjust status, let's say you enter on a visitor visa, if you did so within the first 30 days, it was presumed that that was your intent all along and you'd likely be denied. If you did it after the 30 days, then it was neutral, and then after the 60 days, basically there was no presumption that that was your intent all along. So that has been changed now to 90 days. So if you come in on a visitor visa from a country, let's say Lebanon, not on the list, so has nothing to do with the travel ban. You come from Lebanon on a visitor visa, and you attempt to change your status or something like that, and let's say for whatever reason you don't, but you leave the country, and then if you run into the embassy for whatever reason, you need to get a new visa, they might be able to see that and you might get denied. So just something to consider with the new 90-day rule.
As I would say too, the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is like, say